If you would, go and grab what you want for refreshments, and then there are a couple of seats down front if you're still looking. It's a pleasure to welcome such a large crowd here today for what should be a very, very interesting presentation. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to invite one of our own outstanding faculty to talk to us about a long and distinguished career in the Department of Chemical Engineering and contributing to the chemical engineering profession at large. Today's speaker is Ed Merrill, who got his bachelor's degree from Harvard University, or Harvard College, in 1947, 1944. After he got his bachelor's degree at Harvard in chemistry, he came to MIT where he got his PhD in chemical engineering. Left the chemical engineering department and took a position, he was in Cambridge at the time, with the Dewey and Almy Company. After 3 years with Dewey and Almy, Ed wanted to come back, I guess, to more fundamental research. And so he came back to the department in 1950 and has been in the chemistry department since. And has had a very distinguished record and has made enormous impacts on all of us. Amongst Ed's many honors is the Alpha Chi Sigma Award from AICHE. It's not one number of other awards, but maybe something that few of us have is an award that's named after. Ed, in 1994, the department decided to name or create an award to recognize outstanding teaching in the department, as Ed has been one of the most distinguished teachers in the department's history. So we created an award called the Edward W. Merrill Outstanding Teaching Assistant Award, and it's been given every year since 1994 when it was created. Most recently, sort of the instigating event for inviting Ed to do this talk, kind of a good excuse, is that in this past year at AICHE, Ed was recognized by the AICHE Founders Award. It's an extraordinarily significant award which recognizes a career of contribution to the discipline of chemical engineering in having a profound effect in shaping the discipline. And in Ed's case, he was given the award in recognition of his being the founding father of biomedical engineering and chemical engineering, and for his pioneering research in the field of biomaterials, biorheology, and blood thrombosis. Ed's been at this for quite some time. He created biomedical engineering in our field, at least dating back to the early 60s, when he offered the first course in biomedical engineering at MIT in 1963. I'm told that Ed's interest in biomedical engineering come from some early project that he and his father were thinking about doing. They were thinking of developing an antibacterial aerosol spray for use on the Boston subway system. For what purpose, I don't know. I don't think that ever got off the ground, but Ed certainly took the idea of what chemical engineering could bring to the biomedical area and has done enormous things with that. He's contributed quite broadly in our field, not just to biomedical engineering, but to fluid mechanics. He's done outstanding work in cheap drag reduction, amongst other areas, with the construction of novel viscometers for characterizing the rheology of polymers. So it's a real pleasure to have Ed talk to us today rather than to talk to groups out in the world where he's normally giving his lectures. He's going to talk to us on the evolution of biomedical engineering within chemical engineering over the past 50 years. Ed, it's a pleasure.
Do we have a slide? There we go. Well, I'm overwhelmed by the sea of faces I see in front of me, including a number of my graduate students and students going way back, of which the earliest must be over here, 1951. Right? In talking about how biomedical engineering crept into chemical engineering, I thought I should, with hubris in mind, point out that already when I came back to MIT, biomedical engineering was going, and these are some of the distinguished faculty that were involved at the time, back in the 60s and 70s. Gordon Brownell in nuclear medicine, who still consults for the Mass General Hospital in nuclear medicine. Bob Mann, in mechanical engineering, inventor of the so-called Boston arm, a prosthesis controlled by nerves. Marl Christensen was involved in fluid mechanics of arterial blood flow, as indeed was Asher Shapiro in mechanical engineering. John Trump I came to know particularly well because he was the one who founded the laboratory having the Van der Graaf electron accelerator, which we've used at MIT over the past 50 years, or 60 years even, to great advantage. Larry Young in aeronautical engineering, involved in flutter of valves, heart valves. So it gives you a kind of an impression that other departments of engineering were involved in biomedical engineering. And very importantly, key to this were three officers, Jerry Wiesner, Walter Rosenblith, and Gordon Brownell. Gordon Brown, I'm sorry, not Brownell, Gordon Brown, the Dean of Engineering. And before I forget it, I must say that it was Gordon Brown, the Dean of Engineering, who, when he heard that I was going to go into the study of blood rheology, said, "Ed, I think you're making a great mistake. There's no interest in that in chemical engineering. It's so far out of the field, you never get promoted, you never get tenure. So if you fail, don't blame me." Gordon was a delightful man, and I think he came to realize that there was something to be said for studying the viscosity of blood. Let me read from a piece that I put together back in 1984, History of Chemical Engineering in Medicine, a Bostonian's Account. A Boston lady living on Beacon Hill, footnote, Beacon Hill is a fashionable part of the city of Boston, having fine brick townhouses. In the early days of motoring, made an excursion to California. When asked by what route she had traveled, she replied, "Through Dedham, of course." Footnote, Dedham, a fashionable town 13.25 miles southwest of Beacon Hill. It would not like to be called a suburb. Distinguished by fine estates and some 18th century houses, a summer resort for Bostonians in the 19th century, now year-round home to many whose business lies in the city. For those of you who are not native to this, okay? This account starts with an equally local perspective. Part of the reason, aside from the fact that the author, that's me, is endogenous to the Boston area, lies in the relative close proximity of the Harvard Medical School and its teaching hospitals, the Mass General, the Children's, the Beth Israel, the Brigham and Women's, before they merged recently, to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Over the decades, the interaction between these medical institutions with scientists and especially engineers at MIT has been continuous and fruitful. So it's with that I start this kind of wandering discourse as to how, from my recollection, imperfect though it may be, we got into biomedical engineering as an important part of chemical engineering. Have I pushed? That's what I want. That's good. Thank you. That's what I was hoping for. This is a roadmap of, it demonstrates a number of different things, the number of things I got tangled with, and the expression of Yogi Berra, who said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And as you can see, throughout my career, I've taken several forks in the road, some of which came back to where they started. It starts up at the far top, instrumentation viscosity. And the reason I got into this was that in my Dewey and Almy days, prior to coming back to MIT, I was very much involved in the rheology and the viscosity of polymeric solutions, particularly rubber cements. And so in those days, I developed 2 or 3 viscometers for that purpose. And when I came back to MIT in 1950, I was very much interested in viscometry, especially non-Newtonian viscometry and rheology. And one day, a doctor in the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Dr. Roe Wells, called up, I think it was Gilliland at the time, and said, "Do you know anybody in your department who can work on viscosity?" And that's how I got going on it. And that will evolve in a minute. So from viscosity, we went to looking at blood viscosity and then the living circulation, which you'll see shortly in the hamster's cheek pouch. Then another aspect of rheometry of viscosity was the synovial fluid viscoelasticity, high hyaluronic acid, and Dave Gibbs, the doctoral student who worked primarily on that, is here in the audience today. And then we get into other things, for example, surface interactions, thrombosis, biomaterials, the heart-lung machine, the artificial kidney, the artificial joint with cartilage, and some things on the far right there, which I come up to talk about a little later under the title of fizzles and failures, for reasons you'll see. All right, we're getting close to the. This seems to be. All right. Oh, I see. Good. Well, this is a schematic I made for a presentation back in 1965 to an alumni group, and it shows the circulation in the adult male, or adult man, woman, it doesn't matter. The venous return is blue, the arterial flow is red, red blood comes from the heart, goes through the fine vessels, which I show in that balloon on the side, and that's what you're going to see in the film about to come up. And it also shows that all the pressure drop, or substantially all of the pressure drop in the human body, occurs over the arterial to venous area of the microcirculation. And one more cartoon shows, in a schematic sense, how this converging flow puts the red cells and platelets and white cells through a single file flow in the so-called capillary. And with that, I now want to stop that and run the film. Then we'll come back to it. This film was made by George Fulton and Herbert Berman at Boston University. I'm very deeply indebted to them for what it shows. Here is the hamster, the living anesthetized hamster, whose cheek pouch is pulled out, everted, and put onto the microscope stage. When we get all through this, the hamster wakes up and goes back and eats his fodder or whatever he wants to do. He's not sacrificed. Now, because the cheek pouch of the hamster is transparent, it allows one to see the flow in real time. And what you're seeing is coming from the upper left, an arterial flow that's going through some capillaries and it comes down and reconverges. And as we watch this, you'll see in the venous return, because flow is coming in from the left into this venous return, that the flow is stop-start, anything but regular. You'll also see, as we will get to later, that in the larger vessel, here we are. Well, where's the switch on this? Oh, you open it. Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Now, this is the one that got Ed Gilliland extremely excited. That's why he got much involved in blood rheology, because here are red cells in the hamster coming through a capillary. And notice they're coming through almost like neckle vapors, lying crosswise. And here's a bunch up here that are stationary, waiting for their turn to go through. And so here is a thoroughfare capillary carrying those red cells. And it's in this area, of course, that all metabolism takes place. Transport of oxygen, transport of carbon dioxide, transport of nutrients is in that particular area. I didn't want to have the frog put in, but it got into the tape anyhow, so let's go bear along with it. The funny thing about the frog is that unlike the red cell of the hamster, which is 8 microns, this is about 25 microns. And it's a very flexible body, as you'll see. And in the frog, of course, the hematocrit, the volume percent red cells in the frog is far lower than in the hamster, which is about 40. Notice that this is almost like flipping pancakes, as you see. It goes up and down and around. But these pictures I became fascinated with early on because it shows that if you're trying to measure blood viscosity, here's one caught you see it in division. If you're trying to measure blood viscosity, you've got a non-homogeneous system in which the formed elements, which are red cells, white cells, and platelets, may separate from each other depending upon the local situation in the conduit. Here is a very sinuous flow in the frog. This is in real time. And by the way, the frog doesn't have a cheek pouch. It has a long tongue, and it's the tongue that's been everted. The frog is living, of course. If the frog were dead, there wouldn't be any flow. Right? Now this is very important. Rouleau means a stack, and here is the rouleau of red cells in the frog, in the hamster. And what's happened is that the red cells have plastered themselves together like a stack of pancakes, cemented together by the clotting protein fibrinogen. A very high fibrinogen content will produce these rouleaux. And that tends to produce a drastically impaired rheology. It doesn't flow well. Here is what's called plasma skimming, and from time to time you'll see little platelets jumping off here, whereas the main flow continues through this conduit. So here we have separation of the platelets, the fine clotting elements, 1 micron across, with a few red cells coming through from time to time. And the platelets are very important to us because they are the ones that initiate clotting, thrombosis. If a lot of blood has been lost by any route, here's what you get. A very dilute system here. Maybe the volume percent red cells is 5 to 10%, not much more. Other than that, it's easily reversed if you can put some red cells back in. But this is more disastrous. In fact, this is a disaster. This is what happens if you have a mismatched transfusion of blood. The red cells now not only cluster together and form essentially a loose gel, but they also are giving off hemoglobin. The cells, in part, have ruptured. The membranes have ruptured. So it was in watching these films, as I and my students did month after month, that we started to think about blood flow in fine channels, as in artificial kidneys, artificial heart-lung machines, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how we get going into that. Second thing of the formed elements, the 3 classes are red cells, second class is leukocytes, or white cells. And here we have the white cells, and they reveal themselves by rolling along the wall. You can see them rolling in the background. There's one right there. Here's a white cell. And to the extent that the white cells become sticky and roll slowly along the wall, the blood flow is significantly impaired. And finally, we'll come to a case where we have extreme stickiness of white cells. Here we are, right here. And so the effective channel is significantly reduced in these small microcirculatory vessels. It would be of no consequence in the arteries and veins, but in the microcirculation where the pressure drop occurs, that's where it's very important. And of course, with infection with white cells, the white cells, of course, are mobilized and greatly increased in number with various infections. Here they are. You can see them and distinguish them from the red cells, because first they're not red, they're white, and secondly they're spherical, not disc-like. Tromexan was an experimental drug, and this produced a disaster. As you can see, they've got a pavement now of white cells that are plastered against the wall. There we are. Slow flow still going on, but it certainly is impaired. Tumor will produce the same thing. And these are photomicrographs going back to approximately 1950 to 1960. So that the hamster hasn't changed much since then. It was well done. No biologist would work on the hamster today, as far as I know. They're working on everything else but. Now, platelets. Here's the greatest thing that we have to cope with in artificial organs. These little rascals, these little specks, these are the platelets. They're about 1 micron across, and they are, in fact, so small that, as you'll see in a minute, here's some platelets up here. They are so small that they will undergo Brownian motion. Here we are. That's virtually, it gets better. Don't worry, it gets better. I can't even see it. I don't know why they even left that in. They should have edited it out of the tape. But in a minute. It's getting there. Well, that's not very important because this is in vitro, and what Mother Nature wanted to do is to have the platelet. Here we are. You can see a little bit. They're bouncing around in Brownian motion, which means that they're small, very small. Here, oh, there we are. See, there we go. I apologize and ask your patience for this absurd. Now, boy, watch this carefully. This is what makes artificial organs such a complex thing. Here is a platelet thrombus, which is going to blow downstream. There's an injury at the wall. And within real time, within a matter of seconds, the platelets cluster together, form a dike, and slow the flow down so that the next part of the clotting process can take place, namely the intrinsic clotting system. And this is what anyone working with biomaterials and blood contact has to grapple with, making the platelets not think that they should form a plug like this, a thrombosis. And this is one of the reasons why, one of the things that will do that is to give people aspirin, and that will stop platelet activity, but there are other problems with it. Fine, that's the end of that tape. Thank you very much. Now we'll go back to the next part of this. Ah, yes, here we are. Blood rheology, blood rheology. Guess who's sitting in the chair? Myself. And this is Dr. Roe Wells and his nurse, and they're taking a sample of blood. And what are they going to do with the sample of blood? Well, they're going to put it into... Am I still wired for sound? Thank you. They're going to put it into that device, which is a rotational coaxial cylinder Couette-type viscometer given to the department by Stark Draper, the head of the instrumentation laboratory in those days, which is turned into the Draper Lab. And there is Gilliland, Edwin Gilliland, and it's to him that I dedicate this talk this afternoon, to the memory of Ed Gilliland, a great and good man. And there we are in a view of Gilliland. There's Stark Draper. There's Charles Dowwaller, Philip Gillinson, myself, Giles Coquelet, my first doctoral student in blood rheology. And this is called the GDM viscometer, Gillinson Dowwaller Merrill viscometer. It was also known as the goddamn Merrill viscometer because it was very tricky to operate. But it produced some interesting information. And this, for example, this is the non-Newtonian rheology of normal human blood. H equals 40 means it's 40% red cells. And we have the difference between the red cells in plasma. There we go. Red cells in plasma. And the same volume of red cells in saline solution. In saline solution on this Casson plot, square root of shear stress versus square root of shear rate, there is no yield stress, and it's almost Newtonian. But with the plasma, which contains the protein fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a cement for red cells, and the more fibrinogen you have, the more the red cells stick together, and the higher the yield stress becomes. And this becomes a very important fact governing the flow of blood in small vessels. And this was part of the thesis of Tony Bennis, who was one of the 3 of my former doctoral students, who became a physician, or was a physician, and he's now practicing medicine in New York. And the next slide shows from his work, he had flow through hollow fibers. This work was co-directed by Ed Gilliland and Tom Sherwood. Both of them got very much interested in this problem of rheology. And among the things that Tony showed very nicely were that flow through a hollow fiber gave the same results as flow in a Couette viscometer in terms of the shear stress shear rate relationship. Let's see what comes up next. Always a surprise. Oh, yes. Here we come to the mid part of the harangue. There are 12 parts of this harangue. Yeah, all right. No, thanks. Normally I do this with overheads, but you see, in this particular well-designed lecture hall, to try to show an overhead means it's got to be over there. And it's on a 40 to 5 degrees skew. And when I practiced this last Friday, I immediately decided that that would not do at all, so I had everything transferred to slides. And thanks to our audiovisual people, they've got a projector up there with a strong bulb in it. And so we can see what's going on here, even with the lights on overhead. I hate to turn off lights to project slides because people tend to go to sleep. Whereas with a transparency, with overheads, they can't go to sleep because it's too open, you see. How did I get onto this topic? Oh, here we go. Yeah. Here I try to tell you how chemical engineering started to bring in biomedical engineering in this department. And what you just saw was the beginning of it in the research sense, namely rheology of blood and what governs it. But at this point in time, in 1959, there was an enormously important study that came out, published by Wiley, Biophysical Science, a Study Program. And this had a profound effect on me and many others. And let me just read a couple of the chapters. Molecular Biology and the Physical Basis of Life Processes by Francis Otto Schmidt, one of our greatest biologists. Chemical Characterization of Proteins, Carbohydrates, and Lipids, J.L. Ontley. Molecular Configuration of Synthetic and Biological Polymers, Alexander Rich. Physical Chemical Characterization of Macromolecules, Paul Doty of Harvard's Chemistry Department. Forces between macromolecules, Walter Stockmeyer of our Chemistry Department. Mechanisms of Enzyme Action, Robert Alberti, who became our Dean of Science. Coding and Information Theory, Peter Elias, who became the head of the Electrical Engineering Department. Sensory Performance of Organisms, Walter Rosenblith, who became the provost. Blood Coagulation, a Study in Hemostasis, David Waugh, who I know very well and worked with for many years. And it was this set of studies that suddenly got us involved in the chemistry and the biology as related engineering. And I say that when in this epoch, in 1960 or thereabouts, we got going, in this paper that I made back in 1984, I said the following. It is my impression that two separate circumstances have, in combination, had a major effect on the expansion of chemical engineering in medicine. The political climate of the Sputnik decade, 1955 to 65, and the contemporaneous interest in processing human blood. First, the political climate. Through the efforts of Senators Lister Hill and John Fogarty and their powerful allies inside and outside of Congress, increased level of funding were being obtained for development of research programs in the National Institutes of Health. In fact, the rate of increase of this funding was quite extraordinary. Secondly, with the launch of Sputnik, the time was ripe for J.F. Kennedy in 1960 to propose and win major increases in federal funding for research in all areas. And the National Institutes of Health benefited accordingly. There was a time around 1960 when almost any reasonable proposal to NIH would achieve some level of funding and the available federal funding to engineers to work on problems of biomedical engineering certainly was a very important factor. We were amazed back in those days. Send a request down to NIH and you probably get something. In drastic contradistinction to what's happened recently when 1 out of 100 proposals will get funded. Secondly, and this is an interesting historical thing. It is a fact that the American Society for Artificial Internal Organs published its first volume in 1955, and hemodialysis was one of the most important topics, that is to say, the artificial kidney. The processing of blood, of which this is one form, has interesting precedents. The World War II period had expanded enormously the need for separations of blood components for transfusion, whether they be packed red cells or plasma or platelets. Dr. Edwin Cohn, C-O-H-N, had devised a method for fractionation of blood plasma into 5 major protein fractions by fractional precipitation. He asked for the assistance of Warren K. Lewis and E.R. Gilliland around 1950 in scaling up the process. Lewis and Gilliland brought in James Donovan and his corporation Artisan Industries. Not only did the scale-up involve such operations as decanting, dialyzing the precipitant from the protein, and concentrating or lyophilizing, but other important preceding steps, collecting into appropriate containers and centrifugation. So there's a history of involvement in this department that goes way back into the World War II period. Very quickly, I'd like to mention the history of 1056 chemical engineering and medicine, which I started in 1963. And in 1962, on August 31st, which happened to be my birthday, from 199 Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris, where I was staying with my wife's family, I wrote to Ed Gilliland. While I have been in France, I've had some time to bring into focus one idea for a new subject. I think it would be of considerable educational value in setting up a subject in biomedical engineering requiring the student to bring together several divisions of chemical engineering, thermodynamics, mass transfer, structure of materials, in order to cope with the problems presented in this subject. And the net result of that was that in the spring of 1963, we gave it for the first time. And these were the students. And of those students, James Bell, who's now a professor at UConn, Storrs, was one. Buckles became my student. Meiselman became my student. And the others, I've lost track of them. But in any case, it was a small little class, and it started. And let me just read you the synopsis. Examination of phenomena and problems drawn from biology and medicine and selected for their relevance to either of 2 purposes. Either 1, broadening the perspectives of the chemical engineer, and 2, requiring the application of chemical engineering in analytical methods and in producing a maximum choice among alternative engineering solutions. The subject is considered within 4 categories: fluid mechanics, mass transport and separation processes, chemical processes, and certain aspects of molecular organization and structural properties of biological substances. And the title of it at this time was Chemical Engineering in Biology and Medicine. When we next gave it 2 years later, it was Chemical Engineering in Medicine. Biology had been kind of put on the side, but we were very much involved with it. But really, it was chemical engineering in medicine and surgery. And now we start to see some interesting things. Clark Holden was a student already. And Alexis Bell, who's at Berkeley, head of the department, is he not? Or was. It was a student. And Michael Lysott, 4th from the top, is a professor at Brown University in their biomedical unit, and he also founded cytotherapeutics. And these good students got involved in an expanded program in which we had site visits with Jerry Austin at Mass General Hospital, and Ed Salzman at the VI in blood clotting, Leslie Silverman at the Harvard School of Public Health in air contamination. And let me simply give you one example of a problem that we gave in those days. Listen carefully and see if you can solve it. Estimate, 1, the average number of molecules of oxygen absorbed by one red cell during its passage from arteriole to venule through a subalveolar capillary in the lung, and 2, the average rate of transfer number per second of molecules during the process. They were basing themselves on what they'd seen in the hamster flow films and certain other variables. Now, it turns out that in 1965, and I hadn't realized this before, we had a site visit on May 3rd to the Bigelow Amphitheater of Mass General Hospital, sponsored by Paul Russell, then the chief of surgery, with John Burke and several others. And from our department, there were 2 professors. One myself, and the other one was Professor Alan S. Hoffman. And so it turns out, I think that Hoffman may have got interested in biomedical engineering from his involvement as a co-teacher back in those days. I can't verify it. But anyhow, Al Hoffman, as you'll see in a moment, has a very large operation on the West Coast in the University of Seattle, Washington, University of Washington, Seattle. Moving right along, in 1967, we have a smaller list. And so far, by the way, there's been only 2 women. They were the last slide. Let me go back and see if they're there. Marcia Root and Eva Bergman. Yeah, 2 women out of the whole thing. No women on the first one. 2 here. 1 here, Janet Romanowicz. In other words, back in those days, the graduate student population of this department was 95.2% male. Right, let me see. And Peter Farrell, by the way. Clark, you probably remember Pete Farrell. Would you not say he was one of the most prominent of the bioengineers from Australia? Does he? Yeah, all right. Clark Colvin and I could put on a kind of a dog and pony show because he has a lot of information that I don't have, that he, since he got so strongly into it. In any case, I won't go through the list of what we did except to point out that again we had, in this particular offering, 1967, instructors with the collaboration of Professor K.A. Smith. Do you remember you taught? Yeah. Ed Salzman at the Beth Israel, Jerry Austin at MGH, Mel Glimsher, orthopedic surgeon, Andre Balash, who was head of the Retina Foundation, and they worked on high hyaluronic acid, among other things, and Dave Gibbs, who's here today, and Balash and I were together for quite a while, and Judah Folkman, MD, Boston City Hospital. Now, why he was at Boston City Hospital and what he did in this epoch, I don't quite know. But I'm coming rapidly to the end of this because we're running out of time, and I want to talk about some very interesting things that happened. Okay. That's 67. Let's go on. There we go. Now, this is an optometrist test to read it. But let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'll see down there, Charles Cooney. Guess who he is? All right, course 20, nutrition and food science. And down later on is Jerry Meldon, and Meldon is at Tufts, is he not? Head of the department. Okay. Anyhow, another thing happened here. We have 23 men and no women, whatever. That's why I gave up, essentially, and turned over to Clark. Another curious thing about this. In the outline, the announcement for 1056, spring 1969, Chem Engineering Medicine, Professor E.W. Merrill, 12108, Professor Clark K. Colton, 12144. You and I co-ran that. Those were heady days. We shall concentrate on only 3 topics: heart-lung systems, aerosol therapy for respiratory disorders, and hemodialysis, the artificial kidney. Okay, and in the process of this, we went over to John Merrill's unit at the Brigham Hospital and watched hemodialysis going on for patients who were pre-transplant. And among the things we find out was it cost $312 per dialysis, 3 per week, so it was $1,000 per week for these patients in the hospital. It's 6 months median waiting list for a liver donor, and the home dialysis list is used. Home dialysis is used if the waiting list, if the guy can't be done in less than 6 months because of the tremendous cost of it. Topic number 6. Topic number 6. I've now passed beyond the issue of. Oh, I shouldn't go quite so fast. I got to make one statement here. Oh, I'd kick myself if I didn't read this to you. This is from Industrial Engineering Chemistry back in 1968, December 1968, the year before this. There had been an AICH symposium in Boston in 1964, the first one on biomedical engineering in chemical engineering. Then in 1966, the ACS Division of Industrial and Engineering Chemistry sponsored the 33rd Annual Chemical Engineering Symposium entitled Chemical Engineering in Medicine and Biology. This symposium was just one of many held both previously and since, which demonstrates the chemical engineer's growing involvement in areas outside of the scope of his traditional disciplines. Daniel Hershey, in his introduction to this thing, said, quote, chemical engineers, by virtue of their background, education, and training in non-Newtonian flow, chemistry, chemical reactor kinetics, mass transfer, mathematics, and process dynamics, are well qualified to examine problems in the engineering-life sciences interface, close quote. Despite the undoubted logic of Hershey's statement, there may be danger in this venture into bioengineering, or biomedical engineering if you prefer. The danger lies in the possible wholesale adoption of this involvement as the main facets of an appeal to high school students to make their careers in chem engineering. There are already signs at universities starting courses involving the design of artificial kidneys and the like, expressly to attract the altruistically inclined student. Quote, become a chemical engineer, close quote. Such appeals seem to say, quote, and perform a useful service to society, close quote. What worries us here, that is to say, Mr. D.H. Michael Bowen, what worries him, not us, him. What worries us here is the underlying assumption that the engineer is only useful to society when contributing directly to the continuance of human life. Nothing could be further from the truth. The design of an ethylene glycol reactor or a lubricating oil dewaxing unit is doubtless much less glamorous than providing a hospital patient with a new kidney. I would certainly say so. But it is considerably more important in furthering the technical and economic process on which, for better or for worse, the advancement of our society depends. What society is that? I guess the society in large. It also provides and taxes the federal funds which support most bioengineering research. So this wet blanket wrote that, but it didn't stop. It didn't stop the process at all. He was a lone voice speaking by himself, and he didn't bring it to a halt. Now a few brief remarks on hemodialysis and the artificial kidney. I again quote from my 1984 paper. The story of hemodialysis spans the continental United States. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Charlie Cooney, back in those days, when he was a student in 1056, was a pretty good student. And he said, the best answer to problem number 4 in the paper that he wrote. Okay. Okay. Oh, I forgot. Here's another thing. It'll only take a second to explain. The reason I gave up 1056 was I went on sabbatical to Judah Folkman's laboratory in 1970, and Clark Colton took over 1056 and its successors. And then when I was in Judah's laboratory, I learned a great many things, and I have the highest respect for that fellow. Even back in those days, he was looking for the angiogenesis factor and trying to stop it. And I have, in my records, this is 1970, he was working day and night on this thing. One of the things he said, which has struck me as being enormously important, is, quoting James Jeans, an experiment is a question to Mother Nature that she can answer yes or no. And if you ask a stupid question, you get a stupid answer. In other words, in the design of the experiments that Judah was designing to find out what are the origins of angiogenesis, they have to be very carefully designed. I won't go into how we had students over there in his laboratory. I had a laboratory in Children's Hospital for a year or so. But what I want to go on to now is indeed the next. The next talk. This is hemodialysis. The story of hemodialysis spans the continental United States, going back to Dr. Belding Scribner, here he is, in Seattle, and Dr. John P. Merrill in Boston. The potential of hemodialysis for the support of patients with end-stage renal disease soon became apparent, as well as the need for a better understanding of the dialysis process, better membranes, and more reliable hardware. Through the extensive support of National Institutes of Health, the chronic uremia program got going, and many chemical engineers, both in universities and in industry, became involved in research and development. And I see Stephen Michaels here in the audience. And his father was Alan Michaels, a distinguished professor, very distinguished professor, who was in this department, and then went on to found Amicon Corporation. And Amicon did indeed get involved very seriously in hollow fiber membranes for the artificial kidney. And I want to point that out. As a result, in this Sputnik decade, one of almost explosive growth of chemical engineering and medicine, 3 major thrusts developed from the artificial kidney and the artificial heart programs, each of which proceeded to expand into a separate area of investigation. Mass transport relations. Concerning oxygen, carbon dioxide, and dialyzable plasma components in relation to fluid resistances and membrane permeability. This field underlies what would best be called membrane separation. And I go on to say, early, Clark K. Colton, now professor of chemical engineering at MIT, made a large contribution, I would say extraordinarily large contribution, when a report on mass transfer resistances, which he submitted to the artificial kidney program, was published by the National Institute of Arthritis and Metabolic Diseases and widely distributed under a bright purple cover, where it derived its jocular appellation, Purple Passion. We've still got copies around, haven't we? It hasn't changed. I mean, it can be improved on. It's superb. Second, membrane-forming processes became an important branch of polymer technology. And I call attention to the fact that until 1975, chemical engineering was the only department at MIT that doing anything significant in polymers. Then material science and engineering started to set up programs of its own. Finally, interaction between blood and synthetic surfaces became an intensive field of study, the relation of which will occupy another couple of slides. And so we'll pass on now to, here's John P. Merrill, John Putnam Merrill, and a picture of his artificial kidney. He was a dear friend, and he and I served on the study section committee of the artificial kidney program, and we flew down to Washington every other week. And the problem we got down there was they'd say, Dr. Merrill, what do you think? And I would try to reply, and he'd try to reply, and so we had to. I was called Ed, and he was called John, and that's the way it was solved. And these artificial kidneys were enormous machines, very complex. The idea was to have a membrane, in this case cellophane, and you have a dialysate solution on one side, and you have blood on the other side, and you have to anticoagulate the blood so it won't clot in the machine. And this whole business of these early machines, which cost a tremendous amount, and each procedure was extremely costly. Now, as Clark told so eloquently in his talk last year, has become a commodity business. And in the course of our work in 1056, when we went to the laboratory of, or the ward of Dr. John P. Merrill at the Brigham, his associate was Dr. Gustav Hampers, Constantine Hampers, Gus Hampers. And interestingly enough, Hampers then went on to found National Medical, a division of W.R. Grace, and they set up dialysis centers all over the United States under the funding of the national federal funding. And so W.R. Grace had a very profitable division in hemodialysis. Let me proceed to show why the Scribner shunt was so important. Prior to the Scribner shunt, to get a patient connected to the artificial kidney meant venopuncture of both artery and vein, and this was a very difficult thing. So when Scribner on the West Coast invented this shunt that was kept implanted so that it could be opened when the patient went on dialysis, it was a great advantage. Now, I just briefly point out that in my overall scheme, most of the students that I had are over on the far right, and they all involve work on biomaterials of one sort or another. And the ones, they're split into two sorts, really. We come up to Dinser in 77, and then we start with Sada Costa and thereafter. And the difference is that those working after 77 were working on polyethylene oxide. But before I get to that story, let me simply point out the problem with foreign surface contact is it sets off a number of clotting processes. And this is a simplified diagram, and a more complicated diagram is this. But the bottom line is down here. Fibrinogen is converted to fibrin and forms a red clot by a cascade of clotting steps. Platelets also get into the act. But with respect to fibrinogen, here are two molecular models. This is the simple one, which from a polymer chemical point of view is a very bizarre one. And the one with the buggy whips on it is even fancier. And practically every 2 years, the model of fibrinogen would change. But this is the model, this is the molecule which is at the heart of blood rheology. Mother Nature designed it to have red cells stick together, apparently to help make the clots, the red clots, when they're called for. In any case, here is a red clot in an explanted shunt. You can see the red clot coming out from the end. And of the various ways of testing for non-thrombogenic surfaces, probably the best one is the third from the top. And let me get to that. It's using a baboon. And you put a shunt on a baboon and run the blood from the baboon through the shunt and back into him while he's anesthetized for 3 or 4 hours. And then the baboon is released and perfectly happy, never sacrificed. You wouldn't possibly do that. And this develops a tremendous background of experience because you can do two things with it. First, you can find from the shunt material what has been deposited, both by microscopy and by radioisotope labeling. Indium-labeled platelets and iodine-labeled fibrinogen are two in particular. An implant, a total in vivo implant, is a different thing entirely. And so that involves tissue engineering, which is the subject of great scrutiny. But here's where we come now to almost the next to last thing. One of the things I may be famous or infamous for was my blundering upon the fact, I didn't invent it, I blundered on the fact that polyethylene oxide is probably the most bland polymer with respect to not starting blood processes, reaction processes. And the reason is still not obvious to anybody. It's very mysterious. Here is polyethylene oxide in a Stewart model. Given the atoms, white is hydrogen, red is oxygen, black is the carbon, CH2, CH2 oxygen, CH2, CH2 oxygen. And as you can see, it's a fairly compact chain, but it's also distinguished by being very rotatable. It has this lowest characteristic ratio of any polymer we know of. It's the most bendable one we know of. It's soluble in water, benzene, various other solvents, unlike any other organic polymer. So its solubility characteristics are very bizarre. Now, as for testing these things, this is a very brief run-through with Elliot Chaikov's work with the baboon shunt. We used to think that silicone was a bland material. No, it isn't a bland material. And here you can see, brought down on the surface of the shunt, what happened to my, I'll get it here. I pretend I'm the absent-minded professor. I hid it in my pocket. Here is a fibrin clot with red cells embedded in it, sitting on a silicone surface. Here is porous polytetrafluoroethylene, poric, Gore-Tex. And you can see here the red cells have been trapped by fibrinogen copiously. Here, however, is Elliot Chaikov's polyethylene oxide surface, virtually clean with nothing on it. And this is one of the many demonstrations we have of why it's in a very unusual polymer. And I'll pass over quickly to the next section, and then just review the dear students I've had over the years that have worked with me on elaborating polymers in terms of blood contact. And Elliot Chaikov and Cynthia Sung are the ones most recently were involved with polyethylene oxide. And now I'm going to skip this story entirely because we've run out of time. It's a sad story, because in looking at lecithin aerosols for lung therapy, I couldn't get anybody involved with having an interest in it. And so we worked with the Children's Hospital for a while. We worked at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. We worked at the Mass General. And nowhere could I elicit enough enthusiasm for it. So that's one of a number of things. This was a boo-boo. Over at Children's Hospital, we were breaking up kidney stones with sonic cavitation. But of course, that's a stupid idea because you can't put the sonic probe inside the kidney. So I don't know why we did that, but it didn't get anywhere. And here is another one that didn't work out. Trying to make a mandibular prosthesis for a person who's lost a jaw. You take silicone, the plastic surgeon takes silicone, forms it by his hands on a support, then puts it on an electron beam, and then inserts it in the patient. The only problem is the electron beam was over here at MIT, and the Mass General Hospital was across the river, and this became inconvenient, so that didn't work. And I'm going to bypass that entirely, and simply mention, as I promised I would, that we're not the only ones that got into biomedical engineering. In chemical engineering, and for example, John Quinn at University of Pennsylvania, who will be here next 2 weeks from now, will he not, giving the Michaels lecture, was early into it. Obviously, Clark Cohen was earlier than anybody else because he started in 1969, well, about the same time. Ed Leonard at Columbia was one of my undergraduate students, and it turns out that he and I were working on biomaterials almost at the same time. And so I could point out, for example, at Wisconsin there was Lightfoot and Stu Cooper. At Minnesota there was Ken Keller. At Purdue there's Nick Peppers, who was the first to give a course in controlled release. At Stanford, Channing Robertson and his student Bill Dean, working on various aspects of membrane dialysis. At Seattle, by the way, Seattle became very important because Les Babb, working with Belding Scribner, early on got into kidney engineering, hemodialysis. And Alan Hoffman, who went from here out there with Buddy Ratner and Tom Hobbit, set up one of the most important biomaterials programs in the United States in chemical engineering departments. And finally, I should also mention that Rice has Dave Helms and Larry McIntyre in biofluid mechanics, some very good work. And our student, Michael Sefton, set up an enormously important program in Toronto. And Mike must be one of the people who knows more about platelet function than any other person in the world, even including hematologists. Final thoughts here. There are really four parts of biomedical engineering. One is preventative decontamination of water, which goes way, way back, decades. Another one is interventional artificial organs, implanted artificial joints, that kind of thing. You intervene surgically. A third one is restorative, and that's tissue engineering, and it's the hottest topic today. And of course, as you well know, in this department, there are 4 or 5 faculty: Linda Griffith, Doug Laufenberger, a whole host of people working on tissue engineering, tremendously hot. And finally, I'd say another aspect of it is engineering science, and I've illustrated it by 3 topics: blood rheology, lung surfactant, and non-thrombogenic surfaces. Here are the various external, internal devices that can be attached to the human body, just as a kind of reminder. Here are some that are completely implanted: hydrocephalus shunt, artificial pancreas, which has yet to be realized, Dacron vascular prostheses, pacemaker, and all of these things involve materials that must be very carefully engineered. So biomaterials, listen carefully, biomaterials is a very important aspect of chemical engineering in medicine. Finally, I come to recognize what has given me as much pleasure as anything else, namely the students with whom I work, and these is only a selection. When I tried to give this talk in Los Angeles, I tried to get pictures of each of my doctoral students, and guess what? I was refused, because MIT would not release the picture unless I had the written consent of the student. Now, to assemble this would have taken us several months, so I gave the whole thing up. But these students volunteered to have their picture taken, or I took it anyhow. Without. And here we have Europe student Jennifer Rader, Christine Sobatso, and they worked with Cynthia Sung on these silicone biomaterials. There is Elliot Chaikoff, and there's Tim Donahue, and there's your humble servant. Now, Chaikoff is the only student that I've had who was a practicing surgeon when he came in the door the first day. And so he did his doctoral thesis here during the week, and he worked in the Mass General Hospital emergency ward on weekends. Then, oh my God. These are people standing on their head. Don't change it. No, leave it. Reading from right to left. Deborah Savage, Cynthia Sung, Stephanie Sung, and Tim Donahue. And this was spontaneous. This was a Halloween, and they got these costumes on, and then they went over to see my friend Paul Remp in the Marriott Hotel and showed up dressed this way. Almost got arrested, but anyhow. And here are my acknowledgments. I've already mentioned it, but the people within this department that had enormous influence on me were foremost Ed Gilliland. I did my thesis with Fritz Meissner on plastics and polymers. Harold Mickley was a very close friend, and these people, especially Gilliland, were the ones that made all the difference in the world, in the sense that Gilliland bucked Gordon Brown and said, Merrill's doing something rather interesting in blood rheology. Maybe he should be kept on a little bit longer. And so it happened. And then the others, of course, were Jerry Austin and Judah Folkman, John Putnam Merrill, and Ed Salzman, with whom I worked longest in biomaterials. And finally, I want to repeat that guy. I dedicate this talk to Edwin Gilliland, a good and great man. Thank you for your attention.
Time for a couple of questions, if there are any from the audience.
Can you comment on what the problems have been with coming up with artificial blood? There's been all kinds of companies working with the subject.
Yes, because Mother Nature's system for thrombosis is so exquisitely tuned that anything that looks foreign is liable to be attacked. They've been trying to use free hemoglobin, for example, but it's a terribly difficult problem. They've had encapsulated silicone fluids, fluorinated materials. Again, it's a very almost insuperable problem, in my opinion. Other questions?
Questions? Thank you again, Ed, for a very, very interesting talk.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me.